Hey, how's it going, everyone? Just back in with another lesson. This one is related to the seven heads and 10 horns. So I've been kind of just really rereading these over and over again, Revelation 12 and Revelation 13, to see if anything jumps out at me. And so, it's cryptic, without a doubt, because it's extremely open, just the way it's described. This dragon in Revelation 12, it starts out Revelation 12 verse 3, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And so, I would not be surprised, and a Flat Earth Boxer is probably the best channel that I've seen for this, and how those are very likely, actual images that are being seen. And, in heaven, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the revelation that was received by John the Revelator was things that he was looking at in the firmament. And then so it was like the movie, quote unquote movie, playing out, and then that's all he was allowed to write about. And so it was meant to be cryptic. And so when it says, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, it's like he's looking up and seeing like a movie playing out, in the firmament, and then he's writing it down. And so some of it's clearer than others, but that's the way God, communicated to him. Again, I can't necessarily prove that, but that's what I'm guessing from Revelation 12 verse 3. And then also the fact that he's seeing, like a red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns. And so my interpretation, this again, it's not a make or break kind of thing. My position on the two witnesses is make or break. And, my entire ministry rests on that, but not what I'm about to share here, but it's food for thought. I would say it's just my understanding. And to me, it makes more sense than saying these 7 heads and 10 horns are like the G7 and the G10 or the EU and all that kind of stuff, which I hear, I guess. And so this would be my best guess at it. And to me, it makes a lot more sense because all of this is ultimately leading into Revelation 13. And so Revelation 12, if you read it at the beginning, it's talking about the time period of Christ being on the scene. Because if you read verse 4, and his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered to devour her child as soon as it was born. And then we know that this is talking about Christ because of this verse. And she brought forth a man-child who is to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. So after Christ, sacrificed, himself ultimately for the elect, he was taken up, and then there was a religious ceremony that took place after that in Revelation 5. And so, I've done lessons on that, so look at that. But, that's what it means, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And so he was taken away ultimately on a UFO. He was picked up, quote unquote, picked up by the two witnesses, Moses and Elijah. And we see that in Acts 1:10. But this is telling us that this dragon, which I read in verse 3, having 7 heads and 10 horns, existed during the time of Christ. And so if you read Revelation 12, and I've done a lesson on that, if you go through it, it's all the way from then till now. That's the incredible thing. It spans that entire time period. And so that's again why basically all of the Bible, and definitely Revelation, individual chapters, are looping the same sequence over and over again. And so if you read through Revelation 12, it talks about everything all the way up to verse 17. And the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which kept the commandments of God and had the testimony of Jesus Christ, which is referring to the mixed multitude who will give up their life after the elect are taken away. And so that's why it says, and the dragon was wroth with the woman, but was not able to make war with the woman, which represents the elect, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, because the elect are taken away. And so now it's going to go after the rest of God's right-hand side. And so verse 16, and the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. So this dragon is trying to flood the earth ultimately with lies, to deceive the entire earth, and then ultimately God's elect. But like it says here, and the earth helped the woman. And so, I gave my interpretation on that in the past. But, this is God's entire left-hand side doing what it says in verse 9. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. he was cast out into the earth and the angels were cast out with him. So this dragon, 7 heads and 10 horns, is reflective of this deceptive entity. And it says here that it's going to deceive the whole world. And so during Christ's time, it would not have had the technological ability or that expanse, to do that. But then we know that that's happened now in our generation through technology, and then how they're all working together. And then that one world order officially began, September 11th. And so Revelation 9:11, they had a king over them. And so they're coordinated, in their deception, and then working together. But ultimately, Revelation 12 talks about this dragon having that structure, 7 heads and 10 horns. And then it says that it's still operating right up until the elect are taken away. So in the times that we live in now. So that's why I don't accept that it's like EU or something like that. Okay, so again, this is more food for thought, but just maybe another interpretation. So the way that I understand that is that if you have 7 heads and it says 7 heads and 10 horns, most people will put a depiction of that, and I've even put that in my past thumbnail. But the way I would describe this is that there's 7 heads, but each of those 7 heads has 10 horns. So it's not like 7 heads and then 10 horns separate. You have 7 heads, okay? And then I'll use 5 on my fingers, okay? Each of these fingers would have 10 horns. And so if you have 7 heads and you put 10 horns on all of them, then you have 70 horns, okay? And their underlying structure is 7 heads. And so that 7 heads is God's left-hand side mirroring what God's right-hand side does, and they have like 7 angels for the 7 churches. And so God's left-hand side is a mirror of God's right-hand side, and they just copy everything, pretty much. And so, because it's the same God, ultimately, who's above both of them, it's the Most High, but he's using the same language, to describe his structure on his left-hand side. And so, well, what's the significance then of these 7 heads, each with 10 horns? That's the total number of nations. Okay, and so if you just did some digging, the table of nations is a list found in Genesis 10 that includes a list of the founders of 70 nations descended from Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The list includes 26 descendants of Shem, 30 descendants of Ham, and 14 descendants of Japheth. So 26 plus 30 plus 14 is 70. And so that's what I would say it is, because all of these people, obviously Noah is righteous, and there's no debate about that. But God's right-hand side is very, very small, and then even within the nation of Israel, there's a very, very small group within that who are ultimately righteous and not deceived, and that's the elect. And so even within that sliver of all these nations, it's still a very, very small group that's righteous. But ultimately, this group of 70 nations are all working together. In the time, during Christ's time, they're all working together. There are some righteous within them, no doubt. And then that's what God is ultimately doing, is sifting them out, saving the elect and then sifting out the mixed multitude who are from all nations. But ultimately, the majority of this earth is Antichrist. And so even Israelites were working towards, seeing Christ crucified and, conspiring against him. And so that's my understanding. And the reason that it makes sense to me is that it's this structure starts in Revelation 12. If it just started in the end times in Revelation 13 and there was no notion of this structure in 12 or anything like that, then you could say it's the G7 and the G10 or the European Union or whatever. You can use modern day language to identify them. But first and foremost, God in the Bible always deals with nations. He doesn't say like, hey, Europe and stuff like that, like Australia. The land masses don't mean anything really at all, actually. And so even in the last days, the land of Israel doesn't really have any significance in the Bible. The people, the Israelites, do. Okay, huge significance. They're the, quote, stars of the show. So just in general, land masses are not really a thing. And so God is judging nations of people. And so if there is a, quote, answer to what the 7 heads and 10 horns is, it's more likely to be nations of people, not geography, like Europe or something like that, or even like political structures, and stuff like that. But EU, G7, G10, and all that are locations, it's land masses. And so that doesn't make sense, just for me personally. Like, that's not the interpretation that I would go with. So the fact that it starts in Revelation 12, and then this is the structure that's there to receive Christ, and ultimately to devour her child as soon as it was born, like it says in verse 4, then and that's in 12:4. If you add that together, 16. So this is God's entire left-hand side ultimately conspiring to kill Christ. And so that's the same structure that in the last days, when he returns with his elect and the saints, they're going to fight against him. And so it's God's entire left-hand side. Within all those nations, there is a righteous group. Okay, of course, the Israelites. And then, so I'm not saying all of it, is evil, but God is sifting those out, okay, from that 70. But ultimately, that entire group of nations are evil. And they're all working together. And we see that on earth right now. It's like pretty much everybody's lying. And that's completely obvious. It doesn't matter where you are on earth, they're all in on it. It doesn't matter even what they look like. It's just every country and all their leaderships and majority of people just go along with it, except for a small sliver. Okay. And so that's amazing, just to witness that. So that's what I would be inclined to say that it is. And so if you read verse 3, having 7 heads and 10 horns, I would depict that as each of the 7 heads, all of them having 10 horns. And so then you have 7 times 10 is 70. And so that represents the 70 nations, that are the foundation of the Bible after the flood. Okay, so we're starting from quote unquote scratch. And so, and it says here, and 7 crowns upon his heads. Okay, and so this is symbolic language for the fact that if you were to have 7 heads and then you were to put 10 horns on them, around, that would look like a crown. Okay, so imagine again, I'll just use one. Here's 1 head. Okay, and then if you put 10 horns around it, okay, that would look like a crown on the head. And so imagine the 7 heads with the 10 horns, each of them would be a crown. Okay, and so that's what it means. That's what I believe it means in Revelation 12. And then now we have to understand, well, what's going on here? Revelation 13. So again, 12 is leading up to this time. Okay, 12, the end of 12 actually flows into Revelation 13, because again, it says the elect are taken away. Okay, and then the sequence is here and a bit later, but I kind of interpolated. But ultimately, it's the same structure that's happening and exists to quote receive Christ and to ultimately work to crucify him. And then now it's sort of fast forwarding until the last days, in the time of the mark of the beast, which, I think everybody knows my position on that. But Revelation 13:1, and I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea having 7 heads and 10 horns. So it's rising up again. Okay. It essentially went dormant for a while and then it's rising up again. And when did it rise up again? Revelation 9:11. They had a king over them, the king of the bottomless pit. And so let me get that verse. And so that's the official, ceremony for God's left-hand side rising up as a one world government again. Revelation 9:11, and they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. So that is this rising up, okay, of this same structure that exists in Revelation 12 when Christ was on the scene, but is rising up again in the last days, the times that we live in now. But it's described a little differently. Let's read this. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns. And upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And so now they're all together, working together, and they're all evil, okay? All the 7 heads, which are the foundational pillars, okay, the quote angels or the churches of the God's left-hand side, they all have the name of blasphemy. They're all blaspheming God, okay? And then and upon his horns 10 crowns. So all of those 10 horns that were on all those 7 heads, they all have crowns, so they all have power, okay? And so all these 70 nations now have power, and they're working together as one unit, okay? And that officially began on September 11th. So according to Revelation 9:11. And then this verse here, because they're all working together, okay? They're trying to get everybody on earth essentially to go along with their narrative, and then take the mark or worship the image of the beast. So that's my understanding. That's the way I would quote unquote break that down. And then, that's the foundation point. There's to me, going into the other things, it's open to interpretation. Verse 2, and the bear and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear. To me, that's language that's consistent with the way Daniel describes those historical power structures. And so they're all present in that structure. And so it just shows that they're just God's recycling the same soul. So all those empires in the past, the Medes and the Babylonian Empire and all that, they're all part of that structure. Okay. And so it's using language to remind us that they're all rising up again. Okay. All those power structures that were contiguous, one after the other, they're all together now. And then they're working together to implement the mark of the beast. And so, and the beast, sorry, in verse 2, and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him power and his seat and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And so that shows that these heads have existed in the past, and then they've died, and then now they've come back, and so that supports reincarnation on God's left-hand side. All eyes will see him, even those who pierced him. Okay. And so Revelation 13:3 supports reincarnation, and then shows us that this beast, this beast that's rising up is the same one in Revelation 12. Okay. And so verse 4, and they worship the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? You can't. It's the entire earth. They're all on the same team. And so I want people to also understand that Revelation 13, God is making it sound ridiculous, talking about a beast and a dragon and all that kind of stuff. People read this and like, what the hell is that? Okay, it's like we don't see any dragons anywhere, but we do. Okay, people who are in the know, we see, especially if you're a flat earther, you get it for free. And even the financial manipulation proves it, that everybody's working together and they're all lying. Okay, and they're all trying to manipulate everybody to go along with what. So it's plain for us to see that, but that's what I see, here in Revelation 12 and Revelation 13. So that would be my interpretation of the 7 heads and 10 horns. I think it's keep an open mind. To me, there's no way that it's talking about the G7 and the G10 or the European Union or something like that. That doesn't make sense, because this power structure is all working together, and then God puts it in their heart to go and destroy a landmass, which is America. Okay, when God decides to do that, but it's people that's doing it. Okay, it's not Germany or like Europe or something like that. Like, it's the nations. It's all the people that are going to then God's going to tell them, okay, burn America, and they're not even going to prepare for it, because it's their judgment. Okay, and so there's no defense or anything like that. Like, they're all aligned with fulfilling Bible prophecy, all of them, all those 70 nations. And so, that's pretty clear, that's happening. So, it makes the interpretation fairly sound, I would say. But, that's, what is talking about in verse 11, and I beheld another beast coming out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb and spake as a dragon. To me, those I wouldn't... I don't have a position on that. So if somebody had something that was compelling, I would consider it, but I would be a little bit more sticky about the 7 heads and 10 horns, like I said, because it shows up in Revelation 12. So I wouldn't look for modern language to describe that. And I certainly wouldn't look for, like I said, geographies. I would look for nations. So, again, don't take that to the bank necessarily, or, anything like that. It's just my opinion. And, I'll leave it at that as my opinion. If somebody were to teach something else, I wouldn't, but they teach what the mark of the beast is, correct, which is, very, very important. Ultimately, what Revelation 13 is getting at. If they were to teach the same thing as I do about the mark of the beast, then I wouldn't get to like, you're Satanist and call them an actor and all that, which I love doing, but I wouldn't do that right away. Because I wouldn't say that like God told me this kind of thing. Like, this is just my understanding based on what I know about the Bible, and then just, the way God is, the God of the Bible, the God of the Israelites. So I would be inclined to teach it this way, and so ultimately I think either way, however you cut the cake, so to speak, as ETT would say, we have a one world government, and I want people to know it's been in place from the beginning. Okay, It hasn't just come on the scene recently. It's made official, and what their objective is in this modern time to prepare when Christ returns to fight. But it's always been there, okay? Because God was behind it, okay? In Revelation 12, Revelation 13, even in Genesis, okay? Right from the jump. So nothing's new under the sun, literally. So don't think like that, okay? People are waiting for the one world government to come. Are you kidding me? I think even people like Russian vids and Call for an Uprising talk like that. That's absolutely ridiculous. It just shows how little they know about the Bible, because this one world government has been conspiring to kill God's right-hand side from the get-go, okay? And certainly in Revelation 12. So there's nothing new. So, that's what I would say. That's my interpretation of the 7 heads and 12 horns. 7 heads and 10 horns, that it's reflective of all the nations. And then they're all ultimately conspiring to implement the mark of the beast and lure as many people in. And then they're all working ultimately to fight against God when he returns with the elect. Hope everyone's doing well. Bye.